Hello everyone, welcome to another interesting and informative session of the Analyst brought to you by Vajiram and Ravi. In today's session, we will discuss 7 important articles as featured in the Hindu and Indian Express for your comprehensive understanding of the current affairs explained to you in the easiest language possible. The topics are as follows. From the analysis section, in the first topic, we'll try to understand the persisting challenges in the water management sector in our country and what can be the ideal way forward in regarding that. Then, in the second topic, we'll try to learn about the expanded program on immunization by the World Health Organization and the status of vaccination in our country. Then from a simplified section, we'll take up 5 news. We will not only try to simplify the news for you, but also provide the much important value addition, keeping in mind the approaching Mains 2025. So, stay tuned. The lead editorial today in Hindu throws light on the persistent challenges in the upstream and downstream water management and also provide for some innovative suggestions towards the end. The point is that what is this water cycle which we discuss? So the point is that, let's say for example, when you're talking about the upstream sector, it basically consists of the origin of the river sources or the water sources which we have, for example, glaciers, the snow persistent which lies there. And when we talk about the downstream, it basically tackles with the management of the coastal water, lakes, the river flows, the streams which we have. So the point is that this whole concept of water management and the water cycle forms an important component of your GS3 paper under the larger theme of environment conservation. So let's say if you guys get a question on that, let's first try to frame the introduction. For that purpose, the editorial basically emphasizes that how recently the March 22nd was celebrated as the World Water Day and the theme for that was glacier preservation. Or how March 21 for the first time in the history was actually held as the International Water Day for Glaciers by the United Nations. Remember that this year 2025 basically marks the decade of action on cryosphere science which will prevail till the year of 2034. Or this particular year of 2025 is being held as the International Year for Glacier Preservation. So all of this information can actually be used to kind of create an introduction. At the same time, there is much more emphasis on these water towers, these glaciers which we have in our country as well as in the various parts of the world, and that has been put a lot of impetus upon by the World Water Development Report 2025, which has been released by the United Nations, citing that how water scarcity is actually kind of engulfing all across the world, and for that purpose the preservation of this water tower, not only for the sustainable development of the mountainous region but also the development towards the downstream region has become prominent. The point is that when we talk about our country in the north is basically surrounded by the Hindu Kush Himalayas. The Hindu Kush Himalayas, which basically is spread across 3,500 km and more than that, and they are actually found majorly in 8 countries. The western section basically comprises of Afghanistan, Pakistan, India and China. And the eastern section basically comprises of Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar, Bangladesh, etc. Why these Hindu Kush Himalayas or the glaciers which prevail there, why they are so much of importance? Because the 10 river basins which kind of originates from these glaciers, like for example Ganga, Brahmaputra, Mekong, etc., they basically feed 1.5 billion population of the world. Almost 20%. And at the same time, 240 million people are directly dependent for their livelihood on these 10 river basins, and they are originating from what? From these very same mountain towers. The point is that just look at this particular map here. The various major river systems which exist across the Hindu Kush Himalayan region. For example, the Amu Darya or the Oxus River. So you guys can recall a very ancient Indus Valley civilization site here, the northernmost site which the IVC had on the bank of Oxus River. Can anybody of you from the history section can just recall and write that in the comment? Then for example, the Indus River system, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, Irrawaddy, Salween, Mekong which basically forms the kind of the rice bowl for Vietnam. 2 important river systems of China altogether, Yellow River and Yangtze River. The point is that all of these rivers are originating from glaciers. So remember that when we talk about the river flow in the downstream, the feeder source for them is glacier as well as the melt which they get from snow, called as snow persistence. What is snow persistence? So let's say for example these glaciers are along the various mountain ranges. The point is that just because of the virtue of altitude. So let's say, for example, first evaporation took place, then condensation took place. So when precipitation takes place in this particular cold region, because of the high altitude, low temperature which prevails in this particular region, the precipitation takes place in the form of a snow. Now these glaciers has been created by the augmentation of such ice over across the centuries and eons. So it is very difficult for them to be melted. In comparison to that, such snow which we find, they can actually get melted much easier in comparison. That is why if you look at the snow melt percentage share of the total share of the water which is flowing in a particular river, it is 10% of the Ganges, 13% of the water flow of Brahmaputra and 40% of the water flow of Indus. In comparison to that, the glacier melt percentage is very less. For example, only 3% of the Ganga or 2% of the Brahmaputra river total water flow comes from what? Glacier melt percentage. The point is that this snow melt percentage share is declining. Why? Because of the less snow persistence which is prevailing in this particular region, and a very important reason for that is, according to the World Meteorological Organization, how because of the global warming induced climate change, the temperature has already increased by 1.4 degrees Celsius from the pre-industrial level. So the point is that first of all, these glaciers are melting because of the increasing temperature, and at the same time there is less snow precipitation which is taking place across the Hindu Kush Himalayan belt altogether. So the point is that maybe in the shorter span, that is we are talking about the next 30 to 40 years, the water flow might increase in the river systems because of the melting of the glaciers and the snow persistence, but after that the kind of the water flow or the ecological flow in the river is actually going to decline. And there is already a drop in this snow persistence of about 17% in Ganga river, 14% in Brahmaputra and 23% in the Indus river, and thus this is becoming a major concern. So what will happen because of this water crisis which is taking place in the upstream area? It's very obvious that if there is low snow persistence, there will be decline of water flow in the long period, and that will basically hamper or act as an impediment to what? The ecological flow of water. So if the water supply through these rivers will start declining, don't you think that as a humans will start extracting much more groundwater for what? For irrigation and drinking water purposes. So if we refer to the water composite index which is released by Niti Aayog, it says that how currently 65% of the total irrigation uses and 85% of the total drinking water uses is already dependent upon what? The groundwater. So over a period of time, can we say that even the groundwater is actually going to deplete, and that will lead us to further challenges. For example, less water availability for irrigation. That will ultimately transpires to what? Less crop production. And don't you think that is going to impact our food security? So for example, we claim that under the National Food Security Act of 2013, we provide subsidized ration to 66% or 2/3 of the population. And we can only do that because of the surplus of the food which we have. But if that is going to decline because of the less crop production, don't you think that our food security under NFSA 2013 is going to be compromised as well? Then comes the federal issues. So for example, the water scarce states like Delhi and Haryana, they will start fighting for the share of the river water altogether. That will lead to further interstate water sharing disputes. Then comes the less availability and the low quality of water, obviously, and that will further dent our human development which exists. So first of all, it will lead to the compromise of the Sustainable Development Goal Target 6, under which we aim to provide clean drinking water and impetus on sanitation. Second comes the kind of the abysmal ranking which we already have in the Human Development Index of 2024, where we ranked as low as 130th out of 193 countries. That is going to be further decline. And don't you think that such less water availability for human consumption, industrial uses, all of that will further dent our economic growth? And very recently we already registered that how India's economic growth actually slowed down to its lowest since pandemic, and that was only 6.5% in 2024 altogether. Then there are further challenges which are actually being created here because of the dear neighbor which we have, for example, China. Currently, China has the world's largest dam, which is called as Three Gorges Dam. But China is not satisfied with that. China is saying that we are going to create a dam called as Medoc project, on which river? Brahmaputra river, which is going to have a 60 gigawatt of electricity generation capacity, which is already 3 times more than the Three Gorges Dam. And when it is creating that dam on the upstream of the Brahmaputra river, don't you think it is going to kind of act as an impediment of the downstream flow of the Brahmaputra river. And this dam is being created on the section called as Yarlung Tasangpo of the Brahmaputra river altogether. So various suggestions are being made that India shall actually respond by creating a dam on the Siang river of 10 gigawatt capacity in Arunachal Pradesh. So there is also kind of a inter-country disputes which might arise because of this water crisis which is taking place. And to quote some data in your answer, just look at this particular thing. We are taking this data from the Niti Aayog's Water Composite Index altogether. This is kind of the water crisis which is prevailing in our country altogether, where as per the indices, 21 cities including New Delhi, Bangalore, Chennai and Hyderabad, they are going to be run completely out of groundwater by 2020. Then 6% of the GDP is likely to be lost by 2050 due to the water crisis altogether. Around 20,000 Indians are going to die because they will have no access to clean water. And currently there are around 600 million people in our country who are facing acute water shortage. And this is going to be further worsened as the water demand is going to increase twice by the year of 2030 itself. So we have understood the challenges which prevails in the upstream area. What about the challenges which prevails in the downstream area? So here exists a lot of issues in the water management altogether, whatever we are getting from the upstream. The first and foremost is that our population has become unsustainable. The reason for that is that as per the United Nations World Population Report 2024, currently India is home to 18% of the global population, but we have only 4% of the global water resources. So currently India's per capita water availability is only 1100 meter cube per person, which is actually higher than the international threshold for the water scarcity altogether. And thus, as per the Water Risk Atlas of the World Resource Institute, India is going to face an acute water shortage by the year of 2050 itself. That is just right 3 years after when we are going to become a developed nation if the idea of Viksit Bharat prevails. So first of all, there is an unsustainable population. Over and above that, there exist inefficient water management policies altogether. For example, even today the farmers, they are actually kind of much more incentivized to grow water intensive crops, like for example crops like rice and sugarcane. Why? Because the government is saying that we will procure this under the minimum support price. So there is a backing for water intensive crops and the farmers are growing that crop much more, thus extracting further more groundwater, denting and depleting the water resources which we have, rather than putting impetus on less water intensive crops or for example climate resilient crops like millets. So millets are not included in this program of MSP altogether. Then what happens that these rivers are kind of interstate water bodies. So because they are interstate water bodies, many of the time the political considerations comes into play as well. So for example, the state governments, they start holding much more water for their population to just kind of get more votes in the next election, or they start playing the pass the blame game altogether. For example, look here how the erstwhile AAP government in Delhi was actually blaming Haryana for the industrial waste for Yamuna pollution altogether. The second is that there exists a kind of a very serious issue of pollution and contamination of the river water sources which we have. And that basically takes place because of the untreated discharge of sewage and various kind of industrial effluents in these rivers altogether. So obviously there is an issue of management and kind of setting up the accountability in this particular sector. So as per the CPCB, Central Pollution Control Board report of 2022, it actually identified 371 polluted river stretches across 279 rivers in our country. And remember, it is not only cleaning of this water which actually requires much more impetus, but also the waste management altogether. Because India generates around 1.7 lakh ton of waste every single day, and keep this in mind, only 47% of this is treated. So approximately more than 80,000 tons of waste is being generated every day and is just lying there outside being untreated. Many of the time they find their way into these rivers. Then there is issue of obviously the climate change and the lack of infrastructure. The climate change is basically ensuring less precipitation. Flash droughts are taking place. So the farmers are compelled to kind of rely much more on the extraction of the groundwater altogether. And at the same time, there exists lack of infrastructure. So these farmers doesn't have alternatives, like for example, good canal irrigation Or for example, they don't have that much of infrastructure to create rainwater harvesting and store the water in the times of the good rainfall. Over and above the rapid urbanization and inadequate data monitoring, which prevails majorly in the cities where we do not have composite indices of the existing groundwater table or the kind of the stretches of the rivers which has become polluted, all of these factors has further augmented and led to water crisis in the downstream area. So what has been the response by the government? The government has brought a kind of a coherent water conservation strategy under the National Water Policy of 2012. Under which it basically launched a central sector scheme called as Atal Bhujal Yojana, where 50% of the fund is actually being provided by the World Bank. The idea is to actually kind of improve the groundwater management with the community participation altogether. Then there came your Jal Jeevan Mission, which was launched in the year of 2019, which is a centrally sponsored scheme under which ministry? Under Jal Shakti Ministry. So under this Jal Jeevan Mission, the target is what? To provide tap water to all rural households by the year of 2024. Obviously, this target was not achieved, so the scheme has been further extended. The point is that the government is trying to provide at least 55 litre per person per day of tapped water. Then comes your Namami Gange program. The idea is to kind of rejuvenate the sacred Ganga river and its tributaries, to do afforestation along the banks, and at the same time to kind of manage the discharge of industrial effluents in this river. Then comes your Krishi Sichai Yojana. Under Krishi Sichai Yojana, basically the government is trying to put impetus upon the improvement in the water use efficiency by the farmers altogether. By, for example, integration of various kind of micro irrigation infrastructure, or for example, creating rainwater harvesting infrastructure in the villages. Then ultimately there is kind of a setting up of extended producer responsibility on the producers of the waste under the Plastic Waste Management Rules 2022. What does the suggestions which has been provided by the editorial? It basically says a kind of a keyword which you should use in your answer, and that is that we shall adopt a source to sea, S2S approach, which was basically first of all launched in the Manila Declaration of 2012, which majorly emphasized on the protection of marine environment, where it said that we shall adopt something called as ridge to reef approach, where there shall be an integrated management of oceans, coast, islands, all of the water bodies downstream altogether. Then there has been a S2S management initiative which has been launched by the Switzerland Institute of Water. So that is basically has created a kind of a IUCN platform altogether, and this platform basically brings the experts, decision makers and stakeholders all at one platform. Then there is a pollution source working group, which is basically working upon the scientific analysis on the basis of socio-ecological scale of water conservation. So use all of this for your way forward. Keep this particular important topic in your mind. Try to attempt this particular question, and we move forward to the next news, where the editorial actually showcases us the improvements which has been achieved in the sphere of the immunization and the impediment which still persists. This issue of immunization and universal healthcare forms an important component of your GS2 paper under the larger theme of health and governance. The idea is that vaccines are basically a kind of a preventive measure which we take for the disease to take place altogether. So in this particular case, you guys can actually recall the COVID vaccine, which basically led to the development of antibodies in our body, and thus that prevented us from the COVID virus altogether, thus kind of acting as a kind of a countermeasure to the disease which was causing havoc not only in the economic sphere but was also significantly denting our human development altogether. So there is a lot of impetus on the vaccination and the preventive measure of the healthcare by the World Health Organization, as per the economic analysis which has been provided to us by the World Health Organization itself. If we invest, let's say for example, 1 rupees into the vaccination, it actually provides us with 7 to 11 times of the saving cost of the treatment of disease altogether. However, by the year of 1974, there were vaccinations which was available only to prevent 6 kind of diseases. So let's first try to understand a little bit about the history of vaccination. It comes to the 16th century when we have the first mention of preventative inoculations in the writing in China about smallpox. However, it was the year of 1796 when the world's first vaccine was developed for which disease? Smallpox, and it was developed by an Englishman, Edward Jenner. Then 80s to 1890s basically led to the development of further such vaccines like, for example, rabies, cholera and typhoid. Remember that in 1897 the first vaccine against the plague was developed by W. Haffkine. And you guys can actually recall in the context of India about a plague commission which was established under W.C. Rand Commission, and the atrocities which was committed by this particular person ultimately led to his assassination by the Chapekar brothers altogether. So for example, in 1853 the smallpox vaccination becomes mandatory in UK altogether. Comes the year of 1885, it was Frenchman Louis Pasteur who developed the first live virus vaccine for rabies. 20 to 26 there was development of tuberculosis, diphtheria, tetanus, whooping coughs vaccine, basically called as DPT vaccines. In 1944, first vaccine against the flu was developed. 50 to 60 first combination vaccine, DTP, diphtheria, tetanus, whooping cough or pertussis, all of that was developed. And in 1951 there was a kind of a nationwide rollout of BCG vaccine to treat tuberculosis in our country as well. In 1986, first genetically engineered vaccine for hepatitis B was developed. So this basically constitutes the history of the vaccination, and this vaccination has been provided utmost impetus by the World Health Organization under the expanded program on immunization, which was launched in the year of 1974, and it was adopted by our country in the year of 1978, under which there are various kind of disease which are covered, and the government provide vaccination for all of these 12 diseases at free of cost. Disease such as, for example, diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus, polio, measles, rubella, rotavirus, hepatitis B, meningitis, several forms of tuberculosis, as well as pneumonia which is caused by humanophilus influenza type B, as well as PCV vaccine, that is your pneumococcal vaccine as well for pneumonia. The point is that all of these are available at the national level, and at the sub-national level, that is for Japanese encephalitis, there is also a vaccine which is provided only in the endemic districts. All of that, under the expanded program on immunization by the World Health Organization, has led to large scale coverage altogether. For example, there has been increased coverage for DPT, right? Diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus, etc. So first there was a coverage of 5% in the year of 1974 when this program was started, and now it has reached to almost 88% by the year of 2022 itself. Smallpox actually became the first disease to be globally eradicated altogether in the year of 1980. We were recently studying in our analyst that how there has been achievement of 99% polio eradication altogether. It is now endemic only in 2 countries, 2 neighbors of ours, Pakistan and Afghanistan. Then there is a kind of a global vaccination effort which was taken place for the COVID-19. So that brought various international communities, health organizations, civil society organizations at one platform. And thus there was a launch of Immunization Agenda 2030, which basically aims to reduce 50% the number of children who are missing out on any kind of vaccine, achieve 90% coverage for essential vaccines given in childhood and adolescence, and introduce 500 new vaccines in low and middle income countries. On the line of that, our government has launched Mission Indradhanush under the Ministry of Health. It also acts as a kind of a sub-scheme under the Gram Swaraj Abhiyan, where the target is to actually provide vaccination or immunization coverage to at least 3 crore pregnant women and 2.6 crore children. What we do under this particular scheme, we provide routine immunization services to unvaccinated and partially vaccinated people, specifically in the kind of the districts where the vulnerability level is very high. And how we identify the vulnerable districts? By the data which has been provided to us by the National Family Health Survey. The point is that even after such large scale coverage of immunization, there exist persisting challenges. First of all, let's try to assess the challenge in the numbers altogether. So for example, the recent editorial which we are discussing today, it told us that how there has been resurgence of measles in USA. So remember, measles has been already eradicated in USA altogether in the year of 2000 under this expanded program on immunization. But now it is finding resurgence altogether, as there has been registration of more than 1,000 cases in the month of May itself. If we refer to the UNICEF's State of World Children Report 2024, it highlighted that how childhood immunization declined for the first time in a decade, and the year was 2023. For India, a specific study told us that how in India there existed 2 million zero-dose children, the children who has not been provided any kind of vaccine for all of these 12 kind of disease for which the vaccination is available for. Or for example, how in our country there exists lack of human papilloma virus vaccination under the mission Indradhanush. Remember that this human papilloma virus is the major cause for cervical cancer. And if we talk about the cancer which takes place in women, 18% of those cancer cases are actually caused by cervical cancer itself. So it is the second highest reason for the cancers among the women, that is cervical cancer. For which, what is the vaccination? HPV vaccination. Is it available under the mission Indradhanush? The answer is no. So there are persisting challenges, and what are the factors for that? So the World Bank states that how the low financial status of many countries ultimately leads to the lack of investment in the research process which is required for the vaccination. So for example, to develop a particular vaccine, there are several factors, like for example, there is a long gestation period. So you require years of research with no surety of result towards the end. Then to do that particular research, you actually require a state-of-art facility altogether, a very sound technical infrastructure, a kind of a very skilled specialized researcher and the doctor's team altogether. And for all of these purposes, you obviously require a large scale funding. But as per the World Bank, there exist at least 134 such low and middle income countries which lack such infrastructure altogether, and thus there is not that much development of vaccination or filtration of vaccination in these countries. For example, the World Bank report highlights that how in the countries like Nigeria, Ghana, Papua New Guinea, there is actually decline in the percentage of the population which falls under the vaccination altogether. The point is that we can actually substantiate this public spending on the vaccination through the private spending, but there exists the issue of low private share in the investment. The idea is that because of the long gestation period, the large scale capital investment as well as no guarantee on return, thus very low or minute chances of profitability, it actually deter private investment in the research and development in vaccination altogether. So for example, if we refer to our country, 85% of the research which takes place in the vaccine development, that is actually publicly funded. So the private share is very low, it is only 15% altogether. Over and above that, let's say for example, if the vaccine has been developed, there is less dissemination of that at the grassroots level. Why? Because of the poor primary healthcare infrastructure which prevails in our country. So for that purpose, let's take a case study of National Health Authority 2022 report which talks about the villages in the Madhya Pradesh. And it says that how in almost 85% of the villages in Madhya Pradesh, these particular villages were at least kind of 5 kilometers away from the nearest primary healthcare center altogether. So if the vaccination is being provided at such a large scale distance, many of the times in the rural areas, the people actually deter from such vaccination at the early childhood or adolescence level altogether. Then there exists low capacity building at the grassroots level. So for example, the major career of such vaccination drive in the rural areas is home, Anganwadi workers. And these Anganwadi workers have not been provided with any kind of statutory recognition. They are not government workers, they are not provided uniform salaries altogether. Many of the time to travel and provide such immunization, they have to do their out-of-pocket expenditure altogether. So, all of these factors can be understood in the terms of low and middle income countries as per the World Health Organization's report. But what about the developed countries like USA, who has the highest GDP in the world and has a very sound healthcare infrastructure as well? So the today's editorial highlights the other challenges which prevails in USA. Before that, let's first have a look at the India's public healthcare expenditure altogether, which was just 1.3% of GDP in 2020. So just look at the India's public expenditure on health and how it has just been meagerly increased across the decade altogether. And then have a comparison with the other countries. Japan is spending 9% of its GDP. Brazil is almost 4%. China 3%, USA 15%, about which we are going to discuss. In comparison to that, just look at the meager share of our public expenditure which we are doing on the healthcare. Point is then what is the problem in USA? Why again the resurgence of measles which was already kind of eradicated in the year of 2000? The point is that the article suggests that how we are living in a kind of a post-truth world altogether, where there is so much plethora of information available that it is very hard for the people to actually believe even on a substantial truth. So the point is that has led to post-pandemic vaccine hesitancy, and major reason for that is non-evidence-based misinformation circulation. So for example, many people in USA are kind of refraining from the measles rubella vaccination because there is a kind of a misinformation which has been spread there on social media that will lead to autism. Then the complacency of the population, the short-term memory effect which we have about the pandemic which took place very recently and the impact it had on the society. So during the pandemic, we actually adopted various kind of good practices, like for example, impetus on sanitation, wearing the mask to kind of curb communicable diseases at that point of time, or for example, using sanitizers. But don't you think that the moment the COVID wave started declining, we just completely discarded all of these practices altogether? Then the lack of medical education, which actually can bring such sincerity towards our healthcare, preventive healthcare. But in our country, it is all about kind of treatment basis only. That too, we can just go to the pharmacy and ask for medicine, even non-advised by the doctor altogether. So what can be the way forward as per the article today? It suggests that first of all, the vaccination drive shall be further expanded by its inclusion under the Janani Suraksha Yojana and the insurance scheme of Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana or Ayushman Bharat. Then first of all, there shall be a kind of a large scale research for such vaccination and its positive impact, and this research shall be the basis of the recommendation by the doctors at the grassroots level. And we also need to do the concept of social engineering to ensure transparency in research, use narratives, provide support materials, explore the use of innovative technologies such as for example chatbots, virtual reality, illustrate facts through data visualization, actually curb down such address misinformation and monitor the risk perception as well. And for that purpose, there is a large scale use of artificial intelligence and machine learning which we can deploy. The idea is that this expanded program on immunization shall ultimately transform itself to the essential program on immunization as well, as directed by our Article 47 of the Constitution itself, which direct the state to improve the status of public health care. So a hint for the conclusion has been provided. Try to in this particular question. We move forward to the next news, where we are going to cover a very interesting article on the food safety issues in our country. The article basically starts by telling that how today on June 7 we celebrate World Food Safety Day, and the theme for this year is the food safety science in action, where the article basically emphasizes that how India should evolve from narrowly focusing on the preventing food adulteration to embracing more comprehensive science-based approach to food safety. The journey of food safety in our country basically started from the Prevention of Food Adulteration Act of 1954. But there was a major problem. It basically treated all contaminants alike, whether they were intentionally added adulterants, food additives, pesticide residues, veterinary drug residues, or even naturally occurring toxins. So let's try to assess the kind of the issues which prevails with food safety in our country. First and foremost is obviously the issue of adulteration. So for example, just to cut down the cost, many of the time the food producers, what they do, they use substandard product to increase the quantity of food altogether. For example, the adulteration which takes place of milk or edible oils, etc. So if we refer to the Food Safety and Standard Authority of India's report of 2022, it basically told us that the 40% of the milk supply in our country was actually adulterated with diluted water, even detergent, or in some cases urea altogether. I had milk in the morning. But anyway, the second issue is the feeding of empty calories. So what happens that the FSSAI has actually kind of ensured strict labeling regulations on the various FMCG players, on the various packaged products. But the point is that many of the time these packaged products producers, they actually kind of take the advantage of the lack of information among the consumers, and they just do not provide adequate data in their packing altogether. So many of the time these packaged foods are filled with kind of no nutrition at all. Like for example, they do not provide any kind of protein, any kind of important amino acids which are required for our growth. Rather, it solely provides many of the times a large share of sugar product. And this sugar will ultimately lead to what? The disease like diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, etc. Then among these fast moving consumer good players, there exist various kind of corrupt practices altogether. One of such is the mislabeling of the contents which the food product actually contain. So for example, you guys can recall about the ban of the Maggi which took place because it was found that it contains basically high amount of lead altogether. I used to eat Maggi as well. Anyway, there exists lack of infrastructure and thela culture. So the point is that, let's say for example, I'm a small FMCG fast packaging food product producer, and I try to ensure the kind of the nutritional requirements which has been set by the FSSAI. But for that purpose, don't you think that I will need to have a state-of-art facility lab altogether? Or for example, I will need to employ various trained professionals and researchers. But don't you think that will further increase my production cost altogether, and thus my profit margin will further reduce? So why I will actually invest in that? And at the same time, I can also take the advantage of the lack of nutrition information among the larger public altogether. Because in India, we have this culture where we actually want cheap food which is tastier rather than nutritious food which is actually a bit costlier. So we have this culture of taste to yahi milta hai logic, right? Then there comes weak enforcement and inspection altogether, to do regularly inspection by the food inspector to actually ensure the accountability of these various FMCG players altogether. The idea is that the article today highlights that how for this purpose there was enactment of Food Safety and Standard Act 2006, which basically led to the establishment of Food Safety and Standard Authority of India, which is a statutory body, which basically started setting up maximum residue limit called as MRL for pesticides, defining safe level for food additives, adopting a standard for contaminant and veterinary drug residues. It also managed to develop and align India's food safety standard to almost international level. And then it launched various initiatives altogether, like for example, Eat Right India movement, which is aligned with the idea of National Health Policy 2017, under which there are campaigns like, for example, Aaj se thoda kam, to actually, for example, reduce down the intake of salt, sugar, oil gradually in the daily diet of the people. Then it has also kind of envisaged a food hygiene rating system. It has created Food Safety Mitra to kind of guide the various food business organizations across the country with and provide them licensing and training purposes for increasing the nutritious content in their products. Then there is a State Food Safety Index to kind of, create a cooperative federalism, a competitive federalism among the states to ensure food safety in their areas. Then there is also a strict labeling and display regulation 2024, where any particular FMCG produce is kind of directed to have this kind of provisions in their labeling about the percentage, food allergy information, food recall, ingredients which has been used, date of expiration, country of origin. So impetus on Atmanirbhar Bharat, direction for use and storage, nutrition information panel, whether it is a veg or non-veg icon has been added as well, net quantity of the product. So there is a strict labeling guarantee to kind of inform the people altogether. But the article itself highlights that how there prevails challenges in the risk assessment. What are they? First of all, there exists a lack of India-specific toxicological studies. So for example, such maximum residue limit for pesticide, or for example, the advised daily intake for food additives, all of that is actually based upon international data. So obviously there is a kind of a poor reflection of the Indian dietary habits altogether. And then there exists the absence of the total diet study for our country. The point is that, let's say, even if all of this is provided, this maximum residue limit, advisable daily intake, total diet study, there exists a lack of technical knowledge among the larger populace. Because many of the time when these data are being provided in parts per million or parts per billion, ppm, ppb, the large people are not able to understand that whether the produce which they are buying is actually healthy or not. Also, there exist a legacy issues. So for example, the article highlights that how there is an issue in the regulation of monosodium glutamate, which is basically a flavor enhancer that has been extensively studied and consistently found to be safe actually. MSG was only allowed in the meat products, but its use has gradually been permitted in all foods in our country, but with a mandatory warning label that it is actually unsafe for infants. But it says, the article today suggests that how this warning label in our country is actually misleading, because this glutamate is a naturally occurring compound, is abundant in everyday food like tomato, mushroom, garlic altogether. But the point is that because the consumers, when they are looking at the labeling, they are thinking that, oh, it is inherently harmful, and they are not buying the product, even though they are naturally consuming the same with tomato, mushroom and garlic. So there is also such kind of a research deficit also which exists. So the article provides us for a certain suggestion and a conclusion. Suggestions can be to invest in India-specific research, include a more localized toxicological studies and a comprehensive total diet study. To risk communication should be improved by simplifying the scientific messages and replacing confusing label, like for example for this MSG altogether. Then to strengthen the capacity of risk assessor through continuous training, ensure that they stay updated with the latest science for sound decision making. Regular review and updating standards in line with the new research shall be done. And the public trust through various kind of consistent engagement with industry, consumers, that is going to be a key. The conclusion can be on the line that FSI has indeed laid a strong foundation, but there shall be more regulatory decision must be driven by evidence rather than public fear or outdated perception. So another main topic is being covered and we move forward to the next news. There we'll talk about a new initiative which has been launched by the Home Minister, and the initiative is Bharatiya Bhasha Anubhag. What it is? It is basically a Indian language section which has been created to provide an organized platform for all Indian languages to move towards freeing the administration from the influence of foreign language. The idea is that there is going to be further more research and analysis which will now be based upon the mother tongue altogether. So this idea of Bharatiya Bhasha Anubhag was first announced in the budget 2024 with a corpus of around 56 crore rupees. The idea is that, let's say for example, under the official language rules of 1976, if center is forwarding or providing any kind of correspondence to the states which are listed specifically in the section C, let's say for example the states like Karnataka where the people speak Kannada, or for example Kerala where people speak Malayalam, or Tamil Nadu where people speak Malayalam, then official rules 1976 basically says, the language rules, that the correspondence shall be in which language? In English itself. Keep this in your mind that in our country currently under the 8th schedule there exist 22 languages. For example, your Hindi, Dogri, your Nepali, right, Santhali. If we talk about the top 10 mother languages, Hindi basically tops that with almost 52 crore speaking population as per the census of 2011, followed closely by Bengali, Marathi, Telugu, Tamil, etc. The point is that this was exactly the question which was asked in the prelims 2024, where they tried to identify that whether you can identify or not that which of the following forms the part of the 8th schedule or it is a scheduled languages or not. A hint here is basically that there will come a ultimate elimination in your mind that this is going to be for sure wrong because it is kind of a language of other country altogether, but remember even that language is the part of our scheduled languages. What is the difference between a scheduled language and a classical language? A classical language is basically identified by the Ministry of Culture. It started from the year of 2004 and there are certain criteria for that. Like for example, the language shall have recorded history of at least 1500 to 2000 years. It shall be considered as a heritage by the generation of speakers, and there shall be epigraphical and inscriptional evidences for that as well. Till before this year, there used to be 6 classical languages like for example Tamil, Sanskrit, Telugu and Kannada, Malayalam and Odia. This year, there are another 4 languages which has been added: Marathi, Pali and Prakrit, Assamese and Bengali. So for example, do we have inscriptional or epigraphical evidence for Pali? Yes, absolutely. The Sut and Vinay Pitaka, which was basically compiled in the first Buddhist council, which was basically conveyed by the Haranka dynasty ruler Ajatashatru, in which year 483 BC, at which place Rajgir. Then there are Abhidhamma text or the philosophical text of Buddha, even they have been compiled in Pali, in which particular Buddhist council or Buddhist Sangati? Comment that in the comment box, right? In various Ashoka inscription, the language is what? The language is Pali. For Prakrit as well, there are various texts like for example the Prakrit language which will ultimately evolve into the languages like Ardhamagdi, Saurashena, Maharashtri. The language of Satvana's inscriptions altogether, right? The Gautami Putra Satakarni, Pulamai Satakarni, all of that. Even the Gatha Satsai, which was written by a Satvana ruler Hala, is actually considered to be the earliest example of Maharashtri Prakrit altogether. So these are classical languages, and then there are scheduled languages, 22, which are scheduled in the 8th schedule of our constitution. Then what about a question that do we have a national language? Now let's try to answer that by a judgment of the Supreme Court altogether, which was passed in the UP Sahitya Sammelan versus State of UP 2014. In which Supreme Court said that there exists no national language. Rather, there exist two official languages. How these two official languages were ultimately selected? So there is something called as Munshi-Iyengar formula, which led to the introduction of Article 343 in our constitution, which explicitly states that Hindi in Devanagari script is going to be the official language. But the Munshi-Iyengar formula was that there are several states, like for example southern states or northeastern states, where people do not speak Hindi at all. So that will basically count as a kind of an imposition of Hindi as a language on them, just like how we were culturally colonized by the introduction of English as a language by the Macaulay's Minute of 1835. So the compromise was that, okay, before we create Hindi as a kind of a uniform language which shall be spoken across the country, for next 15 years from the commencement of the constitution. So the constitution was adopted basically on what? 26th of November 1949. So from that 15 years, 1964 till 1964, English will also be considered as an official language. Now 1916 was a kind of a turbulent time when there was a kind of a large scale issue of imposition of languages on the southern state was taking place. There was a whole reorganization of a state which was being done on the basis of language altogether. Thus the government took a kind of a madhyam marg and a safe path and passed Official Language Act of 1963, which said that now for the official considerations, English will also act as an official language indefinitely altogether. What is the language of courts then? So under Article 348 Clause 1 of the Constitution, unless Parliament provide by law, all proceedings in the Supreme Court and High Court, they shall be conducted in English. Then Article 348 Clause 2 basically says that there shall be use of Hindi or any other language in High Court, but this shall be permitted only by which authority? Governor. And for this purpose, can governor take a discretionary decision? Nahi. He first shall take the previous consent of president altogether. Then comes the Official Language Act of 1963, which basically authorized the use of Hindi for the purpose of various kind of judgments, decrees or orders, etc. So this is, we have read about that, does there exist any national language, what is official language, what are classical languages, and the languages of the courts as well. A question which I am posing here to you is just to kind of bring you to some kind of a thinking pattern altogether. Just write down in the comment box that according to you, there should be some kind of a uniform official language of our country to kind of bring more integration into the society, or do you guys agree with the kind of the linguistic diversity which prevails? Comment your suggestions in the comment box. We move forward to the next news, where we will try to understand a scientific term which has been appeared in the news, and that is called as messenger RNA. So to understand that, first of all understand that this, let's say for example, is a cell of a human body. Inside the cell of a human body, there exists a nucleus. Now this nucleus basically contains of chromosome. This chromosome is actually responsible for passing of any genetic information. And this chromosome passes this genetic information on the basis of two things. One is protein and other is nucleic acid. This nucleic acid is composed of two such acids. One is your deoxyribonucleic acid or DNA, and one is your ribonucleic acid or RNA. Now both of these DNA and RNA are basically, these acids are made up of 4 pairs. 3 of them are common: cytosine, guanine and adenine. DNA has thymine and RNA has uracil. So we have understood the structure of the cell, structure of DNA, RNA altogether. Now the genetic information which is stored in the DNA inside the nucleus of each cell, this information is basically copied to the messenger RNA. So let's say for example there is a cellular organism. It uses this messenger RNA for synthesis of the protein. And this synthesis of the protein is done on a particle, and that particle is called as ribosome, which is nothing but a specialized cell organelle altogether. And this ribosome is also made up of 4 pairs, for example guanine, uracil, adenine or cytosine. Now how the transfer of this genetic information actually takes place, that basically comprises of 2 processes. One is transcription, other is translation. Transcription is nothing when the cell copies the DNA sequence into the messenger RNA in the nucleus. Translation is when there is a transfer RNA and that brings the amino acid to this ribosome. So this messenger RNA, it moves from the nucleus to the ribosome, where the transfer RNA has already brought the amino acid. So now this particular thing which is your messenger RNA, which has basically brought the DNA sequence and this amino acid, both of them will basically kind of synthesize to what? To make protein, and this protein will be passed as a kind of a genetic information to the next generation. Now there exist types of RNA which we are already discussing. There is your messenger RNA which act as a messenger between the DNA and the protein production, as we already saw. Then comes your transfer RNA, which is basically generally single stranded, and it is this transfer RNA which brings the amino acid to the ribosomes, remember. Then there exists ribosomal RNA, which is the main component. It is this rRNA which combines with the special proteins to form ribosomes, which then read the mRNA to basically create the protein, and that was the last process, the transcription process, where there was an opening of DNA's double helix to expose the bases of each DNA strand, and using one strand for the synthesis of protein, which basically creates the messenger RNA. So transcription, translation. Transcription, when the gene's DNA sequence is copied to the messenger RNA. Messenger RNA then enters to the cell fluid and attaches itself to the ribosome. Ribosome act as the site of the protein synthesis. Translation. Translation RNA basically, or the transfer RNA basically, brings the specific amino acid to ribosome. They are linked together in particular order as instructed by the messenger RNA, because it is containing the genetic information, and that leads to the creation of protein passed from generation to generation. Ye clear hai? Why this is in the news? Because the technology that basically powered the COVID vaccine can also lead the scientists to cure for HIV/AIDS altogether. Because the Australian researchers, they have found that they were able to trick the virus to come out of the hiding, a crucial step in ridding the body of its entirety. So messenger RNA has potential far beyond its use in vaccine as a means to deliver therapies against the stubborn adversaries. Okay? In the case of COVID vaccine, the instructions were for a piece of the coronavirus. In new study, they are found that they can also be targeting HIVs as well. So we can use this messenger RNA just like how we did it to create the vaccine for the COVID. We can also try to utilize the same kind of the copying mechanism to create vaccine for the HIV as well, and that's what on the Australian researchers are emphasizing upon. So remember, this whole process of transcription and translation, they can become important statements in the prelims examination. And we move forward to the next news, where the Reserve Bank of India has actually cut down the rate, that is your repo rate, by 50 BPS or 50 points, 0.5 points. So now let's first try to understand what does the news tells us. The news tells us that in a bid to spur growth at a time when the inflation has already been brought under the check, the Reserve Bank of India's Monetary Policy Committee, which has been covered various times in the Analyst. So the idea is that just try to recall what you have learned about the MPC and write 2 or 3 points about it in the comment box. Try to start practicing this active recalling thing as well. So Monetary Policy Committee basically slashed the policy repo rate by a bigger than expected 50 basis points to now bringing it down to 5.5% with immediate effect. This is going to be, remember, RBI's third repo rate cut since February, and this will do what? Because now, what is, first of all, let's try to understand repo rate. So the repo rate is basically the collateral backed loans which are offered by the RBI to the commercial banks altogether. So can we say that the loans which are now being given by the RBI to the banks, they will become cheaper? So basically that will basically lead to banks having or can lend at much cheaper cost. So their purchasing power has increased. So now the banks will also start lending more to the people, and that will lead to a kind of a more consumption expenditure at the grassroots level. That will also increase basically. So that will reduce the interest burden for the borrowers. But remember, it will also cut the interest which were being earned on the savings by the depositors as well. At the same time, RBI has also decided to reduce the CRR, that is cash reserve ratio, by 100 basis points over the course of the year. Okay. Let's first try to understand what happens if RBI increases this repo rate. So the loans basically becomes costly. If RBI increases the repo rate, loans to the banks get expensive. That means banks will now take lesser loan, and that will reduce the money supply in the economy altogether. But in this case, the RBI has basically lowered down the repo rate. So the loans has become cheaper for the banks. Thus, the banks will now take more loans. They will provide more loans to the people, and thus the money supply will increase. Just the opposite concept of repo rate is a reverse repo rate. This is the rate at which the RBI borrows money from the other commercial banks of the country. The point is that, let's say for example, if the repo rate is increased, it basically increases the cost of lending for the banks. That will lead to the banking products more expensive, less money supply. Okay? In the case of reverse repo rate, let's say for example, if the reverse repo rate has been increased by the RBI, the bank will start keeping more money with the RBI because it is much more profitable for them. In that case also the money supply will decline. Then let's say for example, in repo rate,
the bank at a particular repo rate, commercial banks do not face a liquidity crunch. In the case of reverse repo rate, it is obvious that if the rate are controlled, it will basically lead to the kind of the controlling of the excess flow of funds altogether. What is impact of repo rate on inflation? So it's very obvious, if the repo rates are being cut down, money supply is going to increase, the purchasing power of the people will increase, the inflation will increase as well. In the case of, let's say for example, reverse repo rate, if RBI starts reducing the reverse repo rate, it basically means it is giving less interest rate to the banks. Banks will say that why I will keep my money with the RBI, right? It's better that I give to the loans itself. It will give to the loans, more money supply will increase, and thus it will lead to the inflation as well, right? So remember these two key terms. At the same time, another key term is cash reserve ratio and statutory liquid ratio. Cash reserve ratio, from the term itself, it basically says what? Ratio of deposits which banks maintains with RBI in the form of cash. So RBI says that okay, this much percentage you should keep with me as a cash itself. If the, let's say, CRR has been increased, it basically means what? The bank are keeping much more cash reserves with the RBI, so their lending capacity has declined, correct? So that will help in the controlling the flow of the money as well as the interest rate. So it basically regulates what? The liquidity in the market. Obviously, if I am keeping cash with the RBI, RBI is like, don't worry, I only print the cash, so you don't have to, keep any collateral or something. No interest rate will be provided to you. Statutory liquid ratio is the ratio of deposit which banks maintain with themselves in the form of gold, cash, securities which are issued by the Reserve Bank of India. That basically helps the bank to meet the sudden demand of the depositor, and this regulates what? Credit facility. And for this, let's say for example, if I am keeping the security of the government of India issued by the RBI, it's obvious that I will earn interest. Okay? So remember, repo rate, reverse repo rate, CRR and SLR. We move to the last news of the day, where we are going to talk about a very important international organization which was in the news today, and that is the grouping of 7. Why it has been in the news? Because in a diplomatic outreach towards mending bilateral ties after a year and a half of acrimony and hostility, the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has invited our Prime Minister to the G7 summit. Why there was a kind of a disputed relationship which was prevailing between our country and Canada, which basically kinds of host a large-scale diaspora of ours. The reason for that was that the two countries downgraded their diplomatic ties after Justin Trudeau, the previous Canadian Prime Minister, set off a political storm in 2023, where he actually alleged a potential involvement of the Indian government in the killing of a Canada-based Khalistan separatist. That name of that person was Hardeep Singh Nijjar. India basically rejected the charges as absurd and motivated. So now basically we are kind of re-establishing our ties with the Canada, and we have been invited to the groupings of 7. What is this groupings of 7 basically? It is, remember that this particular grouping is not based on any treaty, and thus it does not have any permanent office, and thus it is basically an informal grouping which, according to the International Monetary Funds, consists of the most advanced economies or the developed economies of the world. To remember it, simply remember all the countries which participated in the World War II. For example, USA, UK, France, Germany, Italy, Japan and Canada. Till 2014, there was G8. Russia also participated in the World War II. But Russia was expelled in the year of 2014 because of its annexation of the Crimea region of Ukraine, right? These particular G7 groupings, the countries basically meet and they say at the superficial level that we are here to promote what? Pluralism, democracy and representative government, the ideals for which our country stands for as well. And considering we are the largest democracy in the world, our participation in such grouping is very important. Remember that because the grouping does not have any permanent office, the presidency rotates annually among the member itself as well. So it is complete prerogative of the host country to invite any country, like for example how the Canadian Prime Minister has invited our Prime Minister. What is the importance of the grouping of 7? It basically contains 10% of the world's population, but remember it contains almost 30% of the world's GDP. So try to answer all the questions which has been posed to you in this particular session. Also try to attend the questions at the end of the video and test your knowledge. With this, we have reached to the end of our discussion today. We will meet in a very interesting discussion very soon. Till then, all the very best for your preparation and thank you.